Familiar names and your little squares and your faces. Um, you're in for a good time tonight, I think. I know people are still coming in, but I'll start my introduction since I have at least, a couple of paragraphs, and then we'll be ready for Britt to read. So my name is Candace Black, and I'm the director of the Good Thunder reading series. I want to welcome you to the last event of Britt Bennett's Edis B. Barber residency. We are, of course, meeting virtually because of safe spacing concerns during the coronavirus pandemic. So thank you for making the extra effort to join us. And you'll notice that everyone is muted just to keep the background noise levels down. Before we begin, I want to express my thanks to several parts of Minnesota State University Mankato for its support. The Department of English, the College of Arts and Humanities, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. We're especially grateful to the endowment, the Edis B. Barber Endowment. I told the story this morning, but I'll tell it again because I only get to tell it once a year. Edis B. Barber was a professor in the Department of English, and she was very severe. She once told a professor to spit out his chewing gum. Passed him in the hall, noticed him chewing gum, and made him spit it out. So she was that kind of teacher from sort of that generation. And she was chair for many years. And then I think I'm telling the story right. She got an award for teaching, and she didn't believe that teachers should get cash awards for teaching. She thought they should be doing it out of, the goodness of their heart and for their spot in heaven. And so she gave the prize money to the department. And because she was such a fan of literature, she said, well, let's invite, a writer to campus. And I think, Rick, you could nod your head if I'm right. They invited Frederick Manfred the first time, or Judith Guest. I mean, it was very early 80s. And everybody thought, wow, that went well. That was really fun. Let's do it again next year. And the next year they invited, I think maybe 2 people, and thought it went well. And boy, we should do that again. And the Good Thunder reading series was a result of that. So Edis Barber planted the seed that has resulted in this reading series. And we owe her a lot. We owe her memory a little moment of thanks. But I'm grateful for her vision and support all those years ago. And I'm grateful to the individual donors who contribute to Good Thunder. It's so easy to do, shameless plug. Just go to our website, gt.mnsu.edu, and click on the red link toward the bottom of any page to get to our dedicated giving page. Every size donation helps. Born and raised in Southern California, Britt Bennett graduated from Stanford University and later earned her MFA in creative writing at the University of Michigan, where she won a Hopwood Award in graduate short fiction, as well as the 2014 Hurston Wright Award for college writers. Her essays have been featured in The New Yorker, the New York Times Magazine, the Paris Review, and Jezebel. She is a National Book Foundation 5 Under 35 honoree, and her debut novel, The Mothers, was a New York Times bestseller. Her second novel, The Vanishing Half, was an instant #1 New York Times bestseller. Michael Donker in The Guardian says, Bennett is a gifted storyteller. This generous, humane novel has many merits, not least its engrossing plot and richly detailed settings. The novel proves to be a timely testament to the redemptive powers of community, connection, and looking beyond the self. Please welcome Britt Bennett.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you all for having me. I'm so bummed that I wasn't able to do this in person, but I am glad that you are all here, and I hope to be back in person once it's safe to do so. So I'm just going to be reading a bit from the beginning of The Vanishing Half, kind of partway through the first chapter. All I think you need to know before this point is that The Vanishing Half is a story of identical twin sisters who live their lives on opposite sides of the color line. In the beginning of the novel, one of the twins, Desiree, has returned to their small hometown for reasons that nobody at the town quite understands. And here's the part of the book where you start to kind of understand why she's back. And also you understand that somebody is going to come looking for her. So this is from The Vanishing Half. On the morning Desiree returned, she got herself half lost on the way to her mother's house. Being half lost was worse than being fully lost. It was impossible to know which part of you knew the way. Partridge Road bled into the woods, and then what? A turn at the river, but which direction? A town always looked different once you'd returned, like a house where all the furniture had shifted 3 inches. You wouldn't mistake it for a stranger's house, but you'd keep banging your shins on the table corners. She paused in the mouth of the woods, overwhelmed by all those pine trees stretching on endlessly. She tried to search for anything familiar, fiddling with her scarf. Through the gauzy blue fabric, you could barely see the bruise. Mama, Jude said, we almost there? She was gazing up at Desiree with those big moon eyes, looking so much like Sam that Desiree glanced away. Yes, she said, almost. How much more? Just a little while, baby. It's right through these woods. Mama's just catching her bearings, that's all. The first time Sam hit her, Desiree started to think about returning home. They'd been married 3 years then, but she still felt like they were honeymooners. Sam still made her shiver when he licked icing off her finger or kissed her neck while she pouted into her lipstick. Washington, D.C. had started to feel like a type of home where she might be able to imagine the rest of her life playing out without Stella in it. Then one spring night, 6 years ago, she'd forgotten to sew a button on his shirt, and when he reminded her, she told him that she was too busy cooking dinner. He'd have to sew it himself. She was tired from work. It was late enough that she could hear the Ed Sullivan Show in the living room, Diane Carroll trilling It Had to Be You. She lowered the chicken into the oven, and when she turned, Sam's hand smashed hot against her mouth. She was 24 years old. She had never been slapped in the face before. Leave him, her friend Roberta told her over the phone. You stay, he thinks he can get away with it. It ain't that simple, Desiree said. She glanced towards her baby's room, touching her swollen lip. She suddenly imagined Stella's face, her own, but unbruised. Why? Roberta said. You love him? And he loves you so much he knocked your head off your shoulders? It wasn't that bad, she said. And you aim to stick around until it is? By the time Desiree found the nerve to leave, she hadn't spoken to Stella since she'd passed over. She had no way to reach her and didn't even know where she lived now. Still, weaving through Union Station, her daughter confused and clinging to her arm, she only wanted to call her sister. Hours earlier, in the middle of another argument, Sam had grabbed her by the throat and aimed his handgun at her face, his eyes as clear as the first time he'd kissed her. He would kill her someday. She knew this even after he released her, and she rolled gasping onto her side. That night, she pretended to fall asleep beside him. Then, for the second time in her life, she packed a bag in darkness. At the train station, she raced to the ticket counter with the cash she'd stolen from Sam's wallet, gripping her daughter's hand, breathing so hard her stomach hurt. What now? She asked Stella in her head. Where do I go? But of course, Stella didn't answer. And of course, there was only one place to go. How much more? Jude asked. A little bit, baby. We almost there. Almost home, but what did that mean anymore? Her mother might cast her out before she even reached the front steps. She would take one look at Jude before pointing them back down the road. Of course, that dark man beat you. What you expect? A spite marriage don't last. She stooped to pick up her daughter, hoisting her onto her hip. She was walking now without thinking, just to keep her body moving. Maybe it was a mistake to return to Mallard. Maybe they should have gone somewhere new, started over fresh. But it was too late now for regrets. She could already hear the river. She started toward it, her daughter hanging heavy around her neck. The river would right her. She would stand on the bank and remember the way. In DC, Desiree Vignes had learned to read fingerprints. She had never even known that this was something you could learn until the spring of 1956, when walking down Canal Street, she spotted a flyer tacked outside a bakery window announcing that the federal government was hiring. She'd paused in the doorway, staring at the poster. Stella had been gone 6 months then, time falling in a slow, steady drip. She would forget sometimes, as strange as it sounded. She would hear a funny joke on the streetcar or pass a friend they once knew, and she would turn to tell Stella, hey, did you? Before remembering that she was gone, that she had left Desiree for the first time ever, alone. And yet, even after 6 months, Desiree still held out hope. Stella would call, she would send a letter, but each evening she groped inside the empty mailbox and waited beside a phone that refused to ring. Stella had gone on to craft a new life without her in it, and Desiree was miserable living in the city where Stella abandoned her. So she'd written down the number from the yellow flyer pressed against the bakery window, and she went to the recruitment office as soon as she got off work. The recruiter, skeptical that she'd find anyone of good character in that whole city, was surprised by the neat young woman sitting in front of her. She glanced at her application, stumbling where the girl had marked colored. Then she tapped her pen on the box labeled hometown. Mallard, she said. I've never heard of that place. It's just a little town, Desiree said, north of here. Mr. Hoover likes small towns. The best folks come from small towns, he always says. Well, Desiree said, Mallard is as small town as it gets. In DC, she tried to bury her grief. She rented a room from the other colored woman in the fingerprinting department, Roberta Thomas. More a basement than a room, actually. Dark and windowless, but clean, and most importantly, affordable. It ain't much, Roberta told her on her first day of work, but if you really need a place. She'd offered tentatively, as if she were hoping Desiree might turn her down. She was exhausted, 3 children in all, and honestly, Desiree just seemed like another to take care of. But she pitied the girl, barely 18, alone in a new city, so the basement it was. A single bed, a dresser, the radiator rattling her to sleep each night. Desiree told herself that she was starting over, but she thought of Stella even more now, wondering what she would make of this city. She'd left New Orleans to escape the memory of her, but she still couldn't fall asleep without rolling over to feel for Stella in bed beside her. At the bureau, Desiree learned arches and loops and whirls. A radial loop flowing toward the thumb versus an ulnar loop flowing toward the pinky. A central pocket loop whirl from a double loop whirl, a young finger from an old one whose ridges were worn down with age. She could identify one person out of a million by studying a ridge, its width, shape, pores, contour, breaks, and creases. On her desk each morning, fingerprints lifted from stolen cars and bullet casings, broken windows and door handles and knives. She processed the fingerprints of anti-war protesters and identified the remains of dead soldiers arriving home wedged on dry ice. She was studying fingerprints lifted from a stolen gun the first time Sam Winston walked past. He wore a lavender tie with a matching silk handkerchief, and she was shocked by the brightness of the tie and the boldness of the jet black brother who found the nerve to wear it. Later, when she saw him eating lunch with the other attorneys, she turned to Roberta and said, I didn't know there were colored prosecutors. Roberta snorted. Of course there is, she said. This ain't that down-poke town you come from. Roberta had never heard of Mallard. Nobody outside of St. Landry Parish had, and when Desiree told Sam, he struggled to even imagine it. "You're jiving," he said. "A whole town of folks as light as you?" He'd invited her to lunch one afternoon, leaning over her cubicle after he'd stopped by to ask about a set of fingerprints. Later, he told her that he hadn't been so desperate about those prints after all. He just wanted to find a reason to introduce himself. Now they were sitting in the National Arboretum, watching ducks glide over the pond. "Light or even," she said, thinking about Mrs. Fontenot, who'd always boasted that her children were the color of clabber. Sam laughed. "Well, you got to bring me down there sometimes," he said. "I got to see this light skinned city for myself." But he was only flirting. He was born in Ohio and had never ventured south of Virginia. His mother had wanted to send him to Morehouse, but no, he was a Buckeye back before all the dormitories desegregated. He'd sat in classrooms where white professors refused to answer his questions. He'd scraped piss yellow snow off his windshield each winter, dated light girls who would not hold his hand in public. Northern racism, he knew. That Southern kind you could keep. As far as he was concerned, his folks had escaped the South for a reason, and who was he to question their judgment? Those rednecks probably wouldn't even let him come home, he always joked. He might go down to visit and wind up chopping cotton. "You wouldn't like Mallard," she told him. "Why not?" "Because they funny down there. Color struck. That's why I left." Not exactly, although she wanted him to believe that she was nothing like the place she'd come from. She wanted him to believe anything beside the truth, that she was only young and bored, and she'd dragged her sister to a city where she'd lost herself. He was quiet a minute, considering this. Then he tilted the bag of breadcrumbs toward her. He had been ripping up the crust of his sandwich so she could feed the ducks, the type of subtle gallantry she would learn to love about him. She smiled, dipping her hand inside. She told him that she had never been with a man like him before, but the truth was she had never really been with a man at all. So she was surprised and delighted by every little thing he did. Sam escorting her into restaurants with white tablecloths and ornate silverware. Sam inviting her to the theater, surprising her with tickets to see Ella Fitzgerald. When he brought her home the first time, she'd wandered around his bachelor's apartment, amazed by his neat linens, his color-coded wardrobe, his big, spacious bed. She'd nearly cried when she'd returned to Roberta's basement after that. He would never again offer to visit home with her. She would never ask him to. She'd told him in the beginning that she hated Mallard. "I don't believe you," he said. They were lying in his bed, listening to the rain. "What's there to believe? I told you how I feel." "Negroes always love our hometowns," he said, "even though we're always from the worst places. Only white folks got the freedom to hate home." He was raised in the projects of Cleveland, and he loved that city with the fierceness of someone who hadn't been given much to love. She'd only been given a town she'd always wanted to escape, and a mother who'd made it clear that she was not welcomed back. She hadn't told Sam about Stella yet. It seemed like another thing about Mallard that he wouldn't understand. But as rain splattered against the metal fire escape, she turned toward him and said that she had a twin sister who decided to become someone else. "She'll get tired of all that play acting," he said. "Bet she comes running back, feeling foolish. You're way too sweet for anyone to stay away." He kissed her forehead, and she held him tighter, his heart thumping against her ear. This was back in the beginning, before his hands curled into fists, before he called her uppity yellow bitch, or crazy as your sister, or off thinking you white, back when she'd found herself starting to trust him. Many years later, when her eyesight would begin to fade, she would blame the years she'd spent squinting at sheets of fingerprints and marking their ridges. Roberta told her once that soon the entire fingerprinting system would be operated by machines. The Japanese were already testing out the technology. But how could a machine study a fingerprint better than the trained eye? Desiree saw patterns that most people could not. She could read a person's life off his fingertips. During training, she'd practice reading her own fingerprints, those intricate designs that marked her as unique. Stella had a scar on her left index finger from when she'd cut herself with a knife. one of many ways that their fingerprints were different. Sometimes who you were came down to the small things. Adele Vignes lived in a white shotgun house that lurked on the edge of the woods, a house first built by the founder and inhabited by generation of Desseurs ever since. When she'd first married, her new husband, Leon Vignes, had wandered down the hall, inspecting the ancient furniture. He was a repairman who wanted to be a woodworker, and he ran a finger along the slender table legs, admiring the craftsmanship. He'd never expected to one day live in a home imbued with so much history, but then again, he'd never expected to marry a Desseur girl, a girl with heritage. He could trace his own family to a long line of French wine growers who'd hoped to build a vineyard in the New World before discovering that Louisiana was too hot and humid for grapes and settling instead for sugarcane. Big thinking crushed by reality. That's what he'd inherited. His own parents had set their sights more reasonably. They'd run a speakeasy on the edge of Mallard called the Surly Goat. The more pious in Mallard would later trace the tragedies to that sinful business. 4 Vignes brothers, none of whom lived past 30. Leon, the run of the litter, the first to die. The house had faded with time, but somehow still seemed exactly as Desiree had remembered it. She'd stepped into the clearing, gripping her own daughter tighter, shoulders stinging with each step. Those brass columns, teal roof, the narrow front porch where her mother was sitting on a rocking chair, snapping green beans into a bowl of water. Her mother still slight, her hair trailing down her back, temples now tinted gray. Desiree paused, her daughter hanging heavy from her neck, the years pushing her back like a hand to her chest. Wondering when y'all would make it out here. You know Lou already called saying he seen you. Her mother was talking to her, but staring at the child in her arms. Mighty big to be carried. Desiree finally set her daughter down. Her back ached, but pain at least felt familiar. A hurting body kept you alert, awake, which was better than how numb she'd felt on the train, moving but trapped in place. She nudged her daughter forward. Go give your mama a kiss, she said. Go on, it's all right. Her daughter clamped around her legs, too shy to move, but she nudged her again until the girl dutifully climbed the steps, hesitating a second before she put an arm around her grandmother. Adele pulled back to get a better look at her, touching her mussed braids. Go take a bath, she said. Y'all smell like outside. In the bathroom, Desiree knelt on the cracked tile to run her daughter a bath in the clawfoot tub. She tested the water, feeling somehow as if she were dreaming. The mirror blackened in the top corner, the chipped, scalloped sink, the wooden floors creaking in the places she'd learned to avoid if she wanted to sneak in past curfew. Her mother snapping green beans on the porch as if it were a normal morning, and yet they hadn't spoken since Stella left. Desiree had called home, gulping back tears, and her mother said, "You did this." What could she even say? She was the one who'd pushed Stella to leave home in the first place. Now her sister had decided she'd rather be white, and her mother blamed her because Stella was no longer there to blame. In the kitchen, she sank into a chair, realizing a moment later that she'd sat in the same place she always had, Stella's chair empty beside her. Her mother was busying at the stove, and for a long moment, Desiree stared at her stiffened back. So that's what you've been up to, her mother said. What do you mean? You know what I mean. Her mother turned, her eyes brimming with tears. You hate us that much, don't you? Desiree pushed away from the table. I knew I shouldn't have come here. Sit down. If that's all you got to say to me, what do you expect? You come from God knows where, dragging some child that don't look one lick like you. We'll go, Desiree said. You can be mad at me all you want, Mama, but you're not going to be nasty to my girl. I said sit down, her mother said again, this time quieter. She slid a yellow square of cornbread across the table. I'm just surprised. Can't I be surprised? All those times Desiree had imagined calling home. When she'd arrived in D.C., settling in Roberta's basement, her mother with no way to reach her. Or after Sam proposed and they took engagement photographs under the cherry blossoms. She'd slid a picture into an envelope, even addressed it, but she couldn't bring herself to send it. Not because she was ashamed of him, that was how Sam took it, but because what was the point of sharing good news with someone who couldn't be happy for you? She already knew what her mother would tell her. You don't love that dark man. You're only marrying him out of rebellion, and the worst thing to give a rebelling child is attention. You'll understand someday when you have a child of your own. After the wedding, after the cake had been cut, after their friends had wandered, boozy and laughing, into the streets, she'd slumped in the back of the reception hall in her frilly white dress and cried. She had never imagined that she might get married someday without her sister and mother by her side. She'd even thought about calling after she'd given birth to a baby girl at Freedman's Hospital. When Jude was born, the colored nurse had paused before wrapping her in a pink blanket. It's good luck, she'd finally said, handing her over, for a girl to look like her daddy. She smiled a little after, offering reassurance to a woman she believed would need it. But Desiree stared into her baby's face, enchanted. A different woman might have been disappointed by how little her own daughter resembled her, but she only felt grateful. The last thing she wanted was to love someone else who looked just like herself. Would have fixed more if you told me you was coming, her mother said. It was sort of last minute, Desiree said. She'd barely eaten on the train, nibbling on crackers and gulping black coffee until the caffeine made her jittery. She needed to plan. Mallard, and then what? Where to next? They couldn't possibly stay here, but she didn't know where else to go. Now she stared around the aging kitchen, missing her own apartment in DC, her job, her friends, her life. Maybe she'd overreacted. The riots had set everyone on edge. A week ago, she'd watched Sam cry as Walter Cronkite delivered the news, holding him on the couch as he trembled in her arms. The shooter was a madman, maybe, or military operative, or perhaps even an agent in the Bureau acting on behalf of the government. They were culpable, perhaps, complicit Negroes working for the wrong side. He was rambling, and she clutched him until the broadcast ended. That night, they'd made love desperately, a strange way to honor the Reverend, maybe, but she didn't feel like herself that night, overwhelmed by grief over a man she didn't know. In the morning, she passed ravaged storefronts with Soul Brother scribbled on boarded shop windows, hasty claims of allegiance written in marker and pasted against glass. The Bureau dismissed everyone early that day. On her walk home from the bus, a scared colored youth, scrawny as the baseball bat he was gripping, demanded her pocketbook. Come on, you white bitch, he screamed, slamming the bat against the pavement as if he could drill to the center of the earth. She fumbled with her leather strap, too afraid to correct him, recognizing herself in his terror and fury when Sam leapt in front of her, arms raised, and said, This my woman, brother. The teen ran off into the den. Sam swept her inside the apartment, holding her against the safety of his chest. The city lit up 4 nights, and on the last night, Sam gripped her naked body and whispered, Let's make another. It took her a moment to realize he meant a baby. She'd hesitated. She hadn't meant to, but the thought of another baby anchoring her to him, another baby to worry about every time Sam was in a rage, she could never have another baby with him. Of course, she didn't tell him this, but her hesitation made it clear, and later, when he'd grabbed her throat, she knew exactly why. She'd wounded him while he was still grieving. No wonder he'd gotten angry. So he liked to throw his weight around a little. Who could blame him, living in a world that refused to respect him as a man? She didn't have to be so mouthy. She could try harder to make a peaceful home. Wasn't this the same man who'd stood between her and an angry boy's bat? The same man who loved her after her sister abandoned her and her mother refused her phone calls. Maybe it wasn't too late. They'd only been gone 2 days. She could always call Sam, tell him that she'd made a mistake. She just needed a little time to clear her head, that's all. Of course, she'd never seriously meant to leave. Her mother pushed the plate toward her again. What type of trouble you in? She said. Desiree forced a laugh. There's no trouble, Mama. I ain't stupid. You think I don't know you running from that man of yours? Desiree stared down at the table, her eyes welling up. Her mother poured milk onto the cornbread and mushed it with a fork the way Desiree had eaten it as a girl. He gone now, her mother said. Eat your cornbread. Late that night, over 100 miles southeast of Mallard. Early Jones received a job offer that would alter the course of his life. He didn't know this at the time. Any job was just that to him, a job. And when he stepped inside Ernesto's, craning his neck for Big Seal, he was only worried about whether he could afford a drink. He jangled the loose change in his pocket, could never keep a dollar on him. 2 weeks ago, he'd run a job for Seal, and somehow he'd burned through the money already on everything a young man alone in New Orleans required: card games and booze and women. Now he was desperate for another job, for the money, of course, but also because he hated being in one place for too long, and 2 weeks in the same place was, for him then, far too long. He wasn't a settling man. He was only good at getting lost. He'd mastered that particular skill as a boy rooted nowhere. Spent his childhood, if you could call it that, sharecropping on farms in Janesville and Jenna, down south to New Roads and Palmetto. He'd been given to his aunt and uncle when he was 8 because they had no children and his parents had too many. He did not know where his parents lived now, if they still lived, and he said that he never thought about them. They gone, he said, when asked. Gone, folks, is gone. But the truth is that when he'd first started hunting hiding people, he tried to find his folks. His failure was swift and humiliating. He didn't know enough about his parents to even guess where to begin. Probably for the best. They hadn't wanted him as a boy. What on earth would they do with him as a grown man? Still, his defeat nagged at him. Since he'd started hunting, his parents were the only people he had never found. The key to staying lost was to never love anything. Time and time again, Early was amazed by what a running man came back for. Women mostly. In Jackson, he'd caught a man wanted for attempted murder because he'd circled back for his wife. You could find a new woman anywhere, but then again, the most violent men were always the most sentimental. Pure emotion, any way you look at it. What really got him were the men who returned for belongings. Too many goddamn cars to count. Always some junk a man had driven for years and couldn't part with. In Toledo, he'd caught a man who'd returned to his childhood home for an old baseball. I don't know, man, he said, cuffed in the back seat of Early's El Camino. I just really loved that thing. Love had never dragged Early anywhere. As soon as he left a place, he forgot it. Names faded, faces blurred, buildings smudged into an indistinguishable brick slab. He forgot the names of teachers at all the schools he'd attended, the streets where he'd lived, even what his parents looked like. This was his gift, a short memory. A long memory could drive a man crazy. He'd been running jobs for Seal, off and on, for 7 years now. He'd never wanted anyone to think that he was working for the law. He caught criminals for one reason only, the money, and he didn't give two shits about the white man's justice. After he caught a man, he never wondered if the jury convicted him or if the man survived prison. He forgot him altogether. And though he'd been recognized in a bar once and still wore the knife scars across his stomach as a souvenir, forgetting was the only way he could do his job. He liked hunting criminals. Each time Seal approached him about a missing child or a deadbeat father, Early shook his head. Don't know nothing about none of those people, he said, tilting back his whiskey. In Ernesto's, Seal shrugged. He had a proper office in the 7th Ward, but Early hated meeting there, across the street from a church, all those sanctified folks staring at him as they trampled down the steps. This bar was Early's kind of place, a little shadowy and safe. Seal was a hefty man, cardboard colored with silky black hair. He carried a silver cigarette lighter that he twirled between his fingers while he talked. He'd been twirling that lighter the first time he'd approached Early in a bar like this one years ago. Early had listened half-heartedly, watching the light glint off the silver and dance along the bar. Son, how'd you like to make some money? Seal asked. He didn't look like a gangster or pimp, but he carried the sleaziness of someone who did barely legal work. He was a bail bondsman looking for a new bounty hunter, and he'd noticed Early. You got a quiet way about you, he said. That's good. I need a man to look and listen. Early was 24 then, fresh out of prison, alone in New Orleans because he'd figured it as good a place to start over as any. He took the job because he needed the work. He'd never expected to be good at it. So good, in fact, that Seal kept approaching him with jobs that had nothing to do with bail bonds. You know about him what I tell you, Seal said, and I ain't told you nothing yet. Well, I don't like to be caught up in folks' affairs. Don't you have nothing else for me? Seal laughed. You about the only man I ever hear say that. Everybody else I talk to be glad not to hunt down some mean son of a bitch for a change. But Early could at least understand how a wanted man thought. The exhaustion, the desperation, the sheer selfishness of survival. The otherwise disappeared baffled him. He certainly didn't understand married folks and had no desire to get in between them. Then again, a job was a job. Why wouldn't he take on something light? He'd just spent 2 weeks tracking a man halfway to Mexico. His car broke down in the desert, and he'd wondered if he would die out there, hunting a man he didn't even care to see punished. If the money was all the same, why not say yes to an easy job for once? I'm not grabbing her, he said. Nothing like that. You just call when you find her. Her old man's looking for her. She run off with his kid. What's she run off for? Seal shrugged. None my concern. Man wants her found. She's from some little town up north called Mallard. Ever heard of it? Passed through as a boy, Early said. Funny place, highfalutin. He remembered little about the town, except that everyone was light and uppity, and once, at Mass, a tall, pale man had slapped him for dipping his finger into the holy water font before the man's wife. He was 16 then, shocked by the sudden sting on his neck as his uncle grabbed his shoulder, staring at the cracked tile floor, and apologized. He'd spent a summer in that place, working a farm on the edge of town and delivering groceries to earn extra cash. He didn't make a single friend, but he did nurse a futile crush on a girl he'd met, carrying groceries up her porch steps. He didn't know how she even entered his mind. He was so young when they'd met, he'd barely known her. By fall, he'd moved on to another farm in another town. Still, he saw her standing barefoot in her living room, washing the windows. When Seal slid him the photograph, Early's stomach lurched. He almost felt as if he'd willed it. For the first time in 10 years, he was staring at Desiree Vignier's face. I think I'm gonna stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we're done.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you all very much. And we've got two up and coming writers next month that we want to really try and support. Michael Torres and Chris McCormick. They need a little attention, so we're giving them. We're very happy to have two faculty members reading next month. So be keep your eyes open for that information. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
And